Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the University of Hong Kong Distinguished Lecture to be delivered by Professor John Kay. This event is co-organized by the School of Economics and Finance and the Institute for China and Global Development. We're delighted to have Professor Kay come to Hong Kong U to talk about other people's money. It's a very exciting topic, especially if other people's money is in my own pocket. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Paul Chow for making the connection so that we have the opportunity to have Professor Kay with us at Hong Kong U. Professor Kay is one of Britain's leading economists. Many of you probably know him because he is a weekly columnist at the Financial Times. He is also a distinguished academic, a successful businessman, and an advisor to companies and governments. Very few people combine so much in one career. And of course, that's because he hails from Scotland, which is very close and dear to Hong Kong. He has also spent a lot of time. He studied at Edinburgh as an undergraduate and then at Nuffield College at Oxford University. Was admitted to fellowship there, and that's how he began his academic career, starting off as a lecturer and then became research director and director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, a very distinguished and influential think tank in the United Kingdom. He, during his career, did important and impactful pioneering research that contributed enormously to both the understanding of the UK economy and many of the issues there, as well as had influence over policy. He also was a professor at the London Business School and is now teaching and lecturing at London School of Economics and Political Science. For a period of time, he was also director of the Syed School of Business at Oxford University. Today, he has written extensively on a variety of topics, but mostly on industry competitiveness, business, and financial issues. He has many significant books, and today I think he will talk about his most recent thoughts about the developments of the global economy, particularly in the financial sector. It's a great pleasure to have you, Professor Kay, to speak on other people's money. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's a great pleasure for me to be in Hong Kong. As you've been told, I come from Edinburgh in Scotland, which is a cold place, but I discovered last night that even in January, it is actually warmer at this time in Edinburgh than it is in Hong Kong. When I was a schoolboy in Edinburgh, way back in the 1960s, banking was a career for the boys in my class who weren't quite bright enough to get the grades which were required to go to good universities. They would join the Bank of Scotland or the Royal Bank of Scotland. A few of them might actually come out to Hong Kong, as we've been reminded. The Scottish connection to Hong Kong is very strong, and HSBC was in some respects for many years almost as much a Scottish bank as was the Bank of Scotland or the Royal Bank of Scotland. They, my classmates, expected to join the bank or the Royal Bank, and they would, if they worked hard for 20 years, they might become branch managers. They would spend a good deal of time on the golf course, at Rotary Club lunches, and expected to retire after 40 years in the same institution with a pension. By the time the Bank of Scotland and the Royal Bank of Scotland both went bust at the end of 2008, these institutions were run by very much cleverer people with good degrees from very good universities, and in several cases MBAs from fine business schools as well. However, these people, as is indicated by the fact that their bank went bust, ran the bank worse, much worse, than the rather less intelligent people who preceded them. How that happened is a story of the process of financialization, and that's the story I'm going to tell this evening. It's really how a banking world that used to be like this, you can see the most famous of all bankers, JP Morgan, in the top right-hand corner. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner the Pony Train Express, which in due course became Wells Fargo Bank. It's how the banking that was this became transformed into the banking that was this. This is a rather famous plaque which was sold at the end of 2008 by the British liquidator of Lehman for its reported a rather substantial sum. I wonder where it is now. And this is the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, in due course to be Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, unveiling that particular plaque. I hope it is.
Dick Fauld's unorthodox style of leadership meant he was admired and feared in equal measure.
Dick took the floor like a statesman, and he proceeded to deliver this fearsome attack on short sellers, the people who were depressing Lehman's share price by being short the stock. And he, rather to everyone's surprise and mystification, he said,
"If we get this right today, hope it will squeeze some of those shorts. And squeeze them hard. Not that I want to hurt them. Don't get that, please, because that's just not who I am. I am soft, I'm lovable. But what I really want to do is I want to reach in, rip out their heart, and eat it before they die."
Dick Fuld also had an insatiable appetite for profits, with or without fava beans.
I don't think JP Morgan would have used quite that language. And those of you who've been on a trading floor will know that there are people on a trading floor who use that kind of language. But they weren't historically people who became chief executives of large public companies. And through the process, the essence of the process of financialization was the rise of the trader, exemplified by the transition from JP Morgan to Dick Fuld. And the rise of the trader was essentially the essence of a process in which a financial system that was based very largely on relationships was replaced by one that was based very largely on trading. In London, people outside the financial sector often ask me what it is that people in finance actually do. In these skyscrapers that occupy the city of London, where the lights are burning late and the limousines are waiting outside, what are the people in these buildings actually doing? And the answer to that is that to a large degree, in fact to a degree that almost defies belief, what they're doing is trading with each other. The volume of trade in global goods and services has expanded very rapidly over the last 50 years. But the volume of trade in foreign exchange markets is today 100 times the total volume of trade, underlying trade in goods and services. Many people in Britain still think that what banks do is they collect deposits from savers and they lend them out to business. And when I tell them that less than 3% of the assets of British banks are loans to non-financial business, they're quite surprised. Indeed, quite a lot of people within the financial sector are quite surprised when I tell them that. The total volume of exposures under derivative contracts today is of the order of $700 trillion. That's a number you can't get your head around. Nobody can get their head around it, nor ought you be able to do it, because it's actually 3 times the value of all the assets in the world. And JP Morgan, the bank which is named after the man you saw on my first slide, JP Morgan actually accounts for about 10% of that, $70 trillion, which is actually more than the value of all the assets in the United States. Many of you will have heard of high-frequency trading, but perhaps not of a company called Spread Networks, which has built a telecoms link through the Appalachian Mountains, whose purpose is to reduce the time it takes to transmit data between Chicago and New York from 7.3 milliseconds to 6.6 milliseconds. Now, just to give you an idea of what that involves, the irreducible physical minimum time it could take to transmit that data is 4.3 milliseconds, which is the time it takes for light to travel from Chicago to New York. And of course, a millisecond is far too small an interval for any of us to notice. It's less than the blink of an eye. And this link only makes sense because at both ends of the link, the trading is being done not by individuals but by computers that have been pre-programmed with algorithms which are the basis of trading. You might ask, and certainly people outside finance ask, first of all, what is all this for? In what way does this activity contribute to the prosperity and functioning of the real economy? And there's a second question that, when you think about it, follows from that, and that is, why is this activity so profitable? If we were to lock the doors of this auditorium and spend the rest of the evening trading bits of paper with each other, then the total value of paper we'd walk out with at the end of the evening would be pretty much the same as the value of the paper we walked in with at the beginning. Where do the profits come from? What I want to do tonight is to say a little bit about these 2 questions. What is finance for? Where does the money come from to make it profitable? The process of financialization, which I've described, has affected not just the financial sector itself, but the non-financial economy. I think we're all aware since 2008 of the ways in which the financial collapse of that time actually had continuing repercussions for real economies. Now, many people say, when you talk about the 2008 events, that financial crises are, from time to time, are just a fact of life. They are things like hurricanes or typhoons that we just have to accept will happen to us occasionally. Actually, that really is not true. What you can see on this slide is a measure of the incidence of financial crisis. I've taken one, which is the number of banking failures, but there are many ways of looking at the same thing that give rise to similar answers. You can see from that slide that what happened is that in the 19th century, as industrialization progressed and financial system develops, you got a steady increase, a slow but steady increase in the incidence of financial crises. In the first part of the 20th century, that accelerated a bit, culminating in the Great Crash of 1929. What you see following that, through to the 1970s, is a period of exceptional stability. There were almost no financial crises in that time. And then what you see in the era of financialization that follows is a steady upward trend in the incidence of crisis, culminating in the crisis of 2008. So these things are not inevitable. They're the product of behavior and of the regulatory structures and architecture that are put in place. We'll come back to the implications of that later. We've also heard a great deal in the last year or two about the rise in inequality in Western economies, and it's worth looking at that in the same frame of mind. What you have here is the share of the top 1% in total incomes. And you'll see that in all the 4 Western countries which I've looked at here, Britain, the United States, France and Germany, there is a steady decline in inequality from 1920 through to the 1970s. But then the trend changes. In France and Germany, it isn't reversed, but it levels out. In Britain, and conspicuously in the United States, it is in fact reversed. And in the United States, the top 1%, hence the slogan of the Occupy movement, the top 1% today take a larger proportion of total income than was true 100 years ago. And if you look at the identities of the 1% and even more of the 0.1%, you will see the extent to which the financial system is key to that. That is, the majority of people who fall into that income group are either people who are employed in the financial sector or they are senior corporate executives, a trend in increased remuneration, which I think has very much to do with the financialization process which I've been describing. So financialization, the replacement of relationship-based finance by transactional-based finance, the shift in banking culture which we've seen has affected the real economy as well as the financial sector itself. I now want to turn the argument round and ask, instead of what does the financial sector do, ask what it is that we want the financial sector to do. What are the purposes of finance in a modern economy? And if I ask that question, I suggest there are essentially 4 answers. Because let's be quite clear about it. Modern economies need finance, and without a financial sector, there is no effective economic development. We need finance, I think, to do 4 things. First of all, we need finance to operate our payment system. We need it to enable us to receive our wages and salaries, to pay our bills. We need it to enable businesses to transact with each other. And that's actually what most people who are employed in the financial sector actually do. The majority of people working in finance are not masters of the universe, paid telephone number salaries. Actually, I talked about the share of the top 1% in total income, and you can see in Britain it had risen from about 8% to 30, 40 years ago to about 13% today. If I look at the remuneration structure of Barclays Bank in the UK, I discovered that the top 1% of people working in that bank accounted for about 40% of the total remuneration of the bank, and half the people who work for that company actually earn less than the British median wage. So that the rewards from finance have been very much concentrated on the top, but the majority of people who work in the finance sector are doing relatively mundane jobs related to operating the payment system. The second thing we need finance to do is what I've described here as wealth management. We need to finance our education when we're young. We need to provide for our retirement when we're old. And we need a financial system to enable us to undertake the kind of smoothing of consumption over our lifetime that actually makes that possible. These aren't the 2 things that most people in wholesale finance do. The people who earn the very large salaries and bonuses, they're engaged in the 3rd and 4th of these functions, which are capital allocation and risk mitigation. And if you describe what it is that finance does today, if you ask people in the city and on Wall Street and in other financial centers what it is they do, they will talk about capital allocation and risk mitigation. I don't have time to go in detail through all of these this evening. I want to say a brief word about capital allocation, only to emphasize the ways in which the process of capital allocation has changed. When Lloyd Blankfein the chief executive of Goldman Sachs, gave a rather foolish interview in 2009 to the Times, he explained that Goldman were doing God's work. Asked what God had particularly in mind when he appointed Goldman Sachs to this function, he explained that what that institution did was to raise capital for investment in business. It was part, he described, of a virtuous circle in which the investment in business, which Goldman Sachs facilitated, created growth and jobs, which in turn generated further savings that were ploughed back via Goldman Sachs into additional investment. There were two errors in that particular analysis. One was that new securities issuance was an important part of what Goldman Sachs did, but over the last 10 years it's actually accounted for less than 10% of their aggregate revenue, and the bulk of these revenues are accounted for by secondary market trading. But the second mistake was to think that securities markets were the way in which the kind of companies that Goldman dealt with actually raised funds for new investment. It isn't. The kind of companies today that are large enough to be listed are overwhelmingly self-financing. That is, they raise more than sufficient money from their operations for their needs. Modern business has changed a lot since the business when the stock markets and capital markets we know came into being. Their initial purpose was largely to fund activities like railways and railroads, very capital-intensive businesses with capital which was very specific to their particular needs. And that model was then developed to apply to the large manufacturing corporations that grew up in the 20th century, breweries, automobile manufacturers, petrochemical plants, and the like. But modern business isn't like that anymore. You will know that the company with the largest market capitalization today is Apple, which is a market cap in today's markets. One has to keep watching to see what it is. But when I last looked, which admittedly was a few hours ago, it had a market capitalization of $600 billion. Of that, less than $20 billion are the actual operating assets of the Apple business. Most of the modern business of that kind does not use very much capital, and such capital as it does use is typically fungible. That is, it's companies' assets that don't need to be owned by the company that uses them, and typically aren't. I was amused to investigate the ownership of Apple's flagship store in Europe, in Regent Street in London, to discover that in fact it's jointly owned by the Queen of England and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. That's the nature of capital ownership in the modern economy. So capital allocation has in that sense changed a lot. But I want to say a bit more this evening about risk mitigation. Because if you ask people to explain in detail how financialization has changed, they will emphasize the ways in which risk management has become more sophisticated over the last 30 years. And it's for that, fundamentally, that is the reason why banks could no longer be run by my school contemporaries, whom I'm not ashamed to say I did slightly better than in the maths exams we got at school. But it's why sophisticated mathematics can now be employed, or is now employed, in the financial sector. To talk about risk mitigation, I want to take you back to a conference that was held in the summer of 2005. It was in August 2005, and every year the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas organizes an event at Jackson Hole in Wyoming, on the edge of the Teton Mountains in the Rockies in the United States. And because Jackson Hole is a very agreeable place, they're able in August to attract the great and the good from around the financial world to this conference. And that conference was a rather special one, because it was the last year before Alan Greenspan retired as chairman of the Federal Reserve. And as you can see, it was the subject of the conference was described as the Greenspan era, and it attracted many people from all around the world to it. There was someone who was determined to spoil that particular party, and you can see him on the right of that particular slide. He was Raghu Rajan, then chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. And what Rajan did on that occasion was to deliver a paper which said that actually what was going on in the credit expansion, which was taking place in full swing in 2005, was in large part the assumption of very long-tail risk, which would generate a series of short-term profits, but was likely in due course to provide catastrophic losses for some of the businesses involved. As I say, this was a celebration of the Greenspan era, and that particular paper was not well received, to put it mildly. The discussant for Rajan's paper was a man called Don Cohen, who explained that Rajan had misunderstood what was going on, and actually what was happening was that financial innovation was making, in his words, the system more robust and resilient by diversifying risks across financial institutions. Cohen was joined by the two people you can see in the middle, with the background of the Teton Mountains, Ben Bernanke on the left, and Tim Geithner on the right. And another attendee at the conference, Larry Summers, was particularly vehement in his denunciation of Rajan. He said he was a Luddite who wanted to take finance back to the era of coach and horses. Well, of course, we now know that Rajan was basically right and the others were wrong. But one thing, and it's an important lesson for students from all of this, is what a friend of mine has described as the unimportance of being right. The fact that these people were not only wrong, but so badly wrong, proved no obstacle to their subsequent advancement. Bernanke, of course, as you know, succeeded Greenspan as chairman of the Fed. Don Cohen, who'd been the discussant of his paper, became his vice chairman. Tim Geithner went on to become Obama's Treasury Secretary. And of course, Rajan was pushed out of his job at the International Monetary Fund. He didn't do so badly in the end, because having gone back to India to work there, he became, after he had been rather triumphantly vindicated, he became the now much respected governor of the Reserve Bank of India. But as Keynes said, it is better to be conventionally wrong than unconventionally right. And Jackson Hole was actually a demonstration of that. But to understand why there were these misapprehensions at Jackson Hole, I think it's useful to go back to a book which I read in the 1990s by a French economist called Michel Albert, who actually became chief executive of a large French insurance company. And Albert wrote a book in which he described the origins of the world insurance industry. And he identified two strands that led to that particular, the development of global insurance markets. One was Swiss villages. And Albert explained how several hundred years ago, in the rather adverse environment of Switzerland, Swiss villagers would get together and mutualize the rather acute risks which they faced in their everyday lives. At its simplest, they would agree that if one of their cows died, the village would club together and buy a new one for the unlucky farmer involved. And you'll recognize the truth in Albert's caricature by the fact that these Swiss villagers have now descended from their mountain villages, drive BMWs and occupy the offices of Munich Re and Swiss Re and similar global insurance companies that transact business around the world. The other origin Albert described was this. It was London, and it was Lloyd's coffee shop in London, where English gents with a good deal of time and spare cash on their hands would gather to gamble. And they would gamble at that time on more or less anything. the health of the king was a popular subject for gambling. So were the results of the battles that Britain was then fighting around the world to establish the British Empire. And they would gamble not only on these things, but they would gamble on the fate of ships at sea. When would the ship return, and would it return at all? And the result of that was that people who were engaged in global trade, which was then developing in Britain, understood that they could go to these people and lay off the risks which were involved in that kind of marine adventuring. And just as Albert's Swiss villages became, in due course, Munich Re and Swiss Re, so the Lloyd's coffee shop metamorphosed into Lloyd's of London, which is still today the centre of the global marine insurance industry. So insurance originated in two kinds of transactions in risk. One was the transaction in risk, which was the mutualization of risk within a homogeneous community, and the other was the risk, the transfer of risk, which is essentially gambling, in which people took different views about the outcome of the same event and agreed that one would lose and one would gain, depending on what that particular outcome was. And that two kinds of ways of thinking about risk transfer has remained true to the present day. It became slightly evident in the mid-1990s, in which people at JP Morgan once again invented an instrument, a financial instrument called the credit default swap. And what a credit default swap is it's an agreement by which if a borrower defaults on a loan, the person who writes the credit default swap will pick up the tab for the loss that's incurred. Now, the credit default swap raised the question, which kind of story is it? Is it gambling, like Lloyd's coffee shop, or is it insurance, like the mutualization of risk? And the International Securities and Derivatives Association commissioned an English QC to deliver an opinion on this, and he delivered the opinion as QCs tend to, which they wanted and hoped for, which was that credit default swaps weren't either. They weren't gambling, and if they were, credit default swaps would have been taxed and regulated as if they were gambles or wagers, but they weren't insurance either. So they weren't subject to the kind of regulation and taxation which they'd have been subject to if they were insurance contracts. That left undefined, and of course this became important, that left undefined the question of what these instruments actually were. But that meant that London became an attractive venue with which to write these kind of contracts. And not to be outdone in this particular market, the United States passed the so-called Commodity Futures and Modernization Act to make clear that these instruments could also be legally traded in the United States. And that was the start of the market in credit default swaps, which turned out to be central to the crash of 2008. We'll understand that in a bit more detail if we look at the so-called Abacus transaction. Now, some of you may have seen, because it's in cinemas around the world, the recently released film called The Big Short. And this is the instrument which is one of the central cases in The Big Short. It's the creation or the Fab Touré, the somewhat self-satisfied individual who appears in this particular slide, was a salesman for these Abacus transactions. And this is what he wrote in an email to his girlfriend. It's not quite the same as what he said on the phone to his clients, but he said, "I'd some input into the creation of this product, which, by the way, is a product of pure intellectual masturbation, the kind of thing which you invent, telling yourself, what have we created a thing, which has no purpose, which is absolutely conceptual and highly theoretical, and which nobody knows how to price." What the instrument in question actually was, and you probably don't really want to know this, but what it was a synthetic credit default swap on a tranche of a collateralized debt obligation made up from a package of subprime mortgages. Now, if I were to try and sell that package to you, I have a bit of paper here headed very complicated financial instruments. You might not want the details of what it is. What you need to know is that it yields 100 basis points more than US Treasury bonds, and it's rated as safe as US Treasury bonds by very respected rating agencies. Now, if you were to buy this from me, you might well be willing to sell it on to your friend sitting to the left, and given the attractions of this particular bit of paper, even if neither of you understand very clearly what it is, you might well be able to sell it on at a modest premium. And I think we would all agree, wouldn't we, that you deserve a bonus for your acumen in perceiving the attractions of this document and in making it widely available. And perhaps, madam, you would like to see if you can interest your neighbour in taking this off you at yet a more attractive price. Now, by the time we're all making our profits and bonuses down here, I suspect some of you at the back of the room are wondering whether you couldn't get in on a bit of this action as well. And you're in luck, because I have here some other bits of paper which have some of the same characteristics, which are structured in the same way, and from which you may be able to make a profit. You can see two things from this. One is that by constructing these bewildering instruments, I can persuade people who don't really understand very much about what they're doing to pick up these kind of bits of paper. You can see how in the short term we're all making profits out of doing it. And you can see how it is that people are persuading themselves that these activities are adding value. And more than that, you can see how they're actually making profits and bonuses out of these particular transactions. And this takes me back to the story of Lloyd's insurance market, because I thought I got a lot of insight into what was going on in that particular period and to the transactions like the Abacus one when I became involved in the early 90s, after Lloyd's insurance market in London had come close to collapse. And the reason it came close to collapse was that it was traditionally a market in reinsurance, which means you agree that if losses on an insurance contract exceed a certain amount, the reinsurer will take over part of that risk. Now, what people discovered in the 80s was that if you could sell reinsurance, you could also sell reinsurance of reinsurance. And then they twigged to the fact that if you could sell reinsurance of reinsurance, you could also sell reinsurance of reinsurance of reinsurance. And if you could sell reinsurance of reinsurance of reinsurance, you could sell reinsurance of reinsurance of reinsurance of reinsurance. Until in the end, you created contracts which were layers of reinsurance on which nobody, with the best will in the world, could drill down and find out what the nature of the underlying risk structure was. And that started to collapse in the late 1980s when an oil rig called Piper Alpha in the North Sea went on fire. It killed 200 people, the oil rig was destroyed, and it was then the largest marine insurance claim which had ever been made. And and that of course triggered reinsurance contracts, it triggered reinsurance of reinsurance contracts, and reinsurance of reinsurance of reinsurance contracts, and so on, until in the end, English gents who had signed up at Lloyd's, who had never heard of an oil rig called Piper Alpha, discovered not just that they'd insured Piper Alpha, but that they'd insured Piper Alpha over and over and over again in the contracts which they'd taken on. And that background gave me a sense of what was going on when these kind of instruments were being sold in 2006. Basically, the people at Jackson Hole thought they were in a Swiss village, when what they were actually in was a Lloyd's coffee shop that had come more and more to resemble that of the 17th and 18th century gents who were gambling, in that case with their own money, but in the world of the first decade of the 21st century. They were gambling with other people's money. That was one fundamental misunderstanding of these participants at Jackson Hole. But there was another one, which is well illustrated by the fact that while they were meeting at Jackson Hole, something very different was going on in a different part of the United States, in Louisiana, in fact. And it was this. As they were meeting at Jackson Hole, Hurricane Katrina was blowing into New Orleans. And Hurricane Katrina caused $100 billion of losses. It killed 1,600 people, and it was the largest economic loss of any natural disaster that there has ever been. And of course, if you ask ordinary people, what are the risks that concern you in your daily lives? There are risks like that. There are risks of natural accidents and catastrophes. There are the risks to do with illness and mortality. There are risks to do with redundancy in employment. There are risks of relationship breakdown. There are risks that need the kind of mutualization of which the Swiss Village was the exemplar. But the risks which people were talking about at Jackson Hole weren't risks of that kind. They were talking about the risks of currency fluctuations, the risks of stock market volatility, the risks of interest rate movements. They were all actually risks which had been created within the financial system itself in the first place. What I'm describing is the ways in which financialization has created a financial industry which is largely divorced from its core purposes of serving the needs of businesses and households. It's looked in on itself, it's dealing with itself, and it's judging itself very largely by criteria which it has itself created. And if I were to talk about capital allocation, which I'm not going to do at any length this evening, I would describe in large part the same phenomenon, in which the businesses of search and stewardship, of looking for new investment opportunities and managing assets that have already been created, in which that business has been displaced by the business of transacting frequently in secondary markets. If that's the story of what has happened in the financial system, then what is there to be done about it? When I talk to an audience outside the financial community about these issues, the immediate reaction is to say, of course, what we need is actually more regulation. And indeed, people will often go on to say that the responsibility for the problems I've described lies very largely with the measures which have been taken to deregulate financial services across the Western world. Well, I'm not sure that's right. I'm not sure either part is right, either that the problems were created by deregulation or that more regulation is part of the problem. And this is just one illustration of what has actually happened to regulation over the era of financialization. Far from it being an era of deregulation, it's been an era of a more or less exponential increase in the levels of regulation. What has happened, in fact, is that regulation has been as much part of the problem as it is part of the solution. Because we've adopted a style of regulation which has attempted to lay down detailed prescriptive rules for behavior in financial markets. And the typical result of that has been that people have invented instruments which are intended to work around the letter of the rules while actually fundamentally breaching their spirit. And if you go back to the credit default swap, which Mr. Potts decided was neither insurance on the one hand, nor gambling on the other, there's a sense in which he was right. Because what the credit default swap was created to do was as a main means of what we call regulatory arbitrage. It was the product of regulation. Because we introduced rules that said, if you were a bank making a loan, you have to provide regulatory capital based on the size of the loan. On the other hand, if you are an insurance company, you have to make regulatory capital aside based on the scale of your expected loss. The result of that is that if you are doing something like making a large loan to ExxonMobil, which will be a very large loan, but will carry a very low risk of loss, it's much better if you can have that transaction treated as insurance rather than as lending. And that was the initial purpose of the credit default swap. It came into being as a result of regulation, but as with so many innovations in financial markets, it then got out of hand until Fabturi was selling this kind of stuff to his clients. Or were they his clients? We'll come back to that in a moment. Because I believe what we need is a very different approach to financial market regulation. One that gets away from the idea that we're trying to regulate this industry through larger and larger quantities of rules, but one that says we focus on the structure of the industry and the incentives, both at the personal level and at the business level, of people within the sector. By changing the structure of the industry, what I would like to see is a world that gets away from the financial conglomerates which have been the characteristic institution of the last 20 or 30 years of financialization, and restores, as it were, specialist businesses focused on the particular needs of users. That means not just divorcing investment banking from a rather dull, boring retail banking system of operating the payment system and lending to us on mortgages. It means recognizing that investment banking activities today consist of a variety of functions like corporate advice, like securities issuance, like market making, like taking positions on your own account, engaging in asset management on behalf of other people and institutions. All activities which, if you list them, come into conflict with each other. And the firms involved have actually failed to manage these conflicts effectively. And if we want an illustration of that, we can simply go back yet again to that Abacus transaction in credit default swaps. Because what happened there was that Goldman designed an instrument based on a selection of subprime mortgages which had been chosen by a hedge fund manager, John Paulson, as particularly likely to fail. Goldman then created these securities and it sold them to its customers. So who was Goldman acting for in that transaction? For Paulson, the hedge fund manager? For the Goldman clients to whom it was selling these securities? Or was it acting on its own behalf? I'm not the first person to ask that question. In 2010, after that transaction had unwound, Goldman executives were hauled before a Senate committee to explain what it is that they had.
But did the firm expect you to act in the best interests of your clients?
I believe we have a duty to serve our clients well.
I guess, Mr. Chairman, that I'm not going to get an answer to my question any more than you did with yours.
It gets worse, I'm afraid.
And when you heard that your employees in these emails, when looking at these deals, said, God, what a shitty deal. God, what a piece of crap. When you hear your own employees or read about those in the emails, do you feel anything?
I think that's very unfortunate to have on email.
Are you embarrassed?
And very unfortunate. I don't.
On
again,
email, it's
please don't take that
how
the wrong
about
way.
feeling that way?
I think it's very unfortunate for anyone to have said that in any form.
How about to believe that and sell it?
I think that's unfortunate as well.
There's an even better version of that story. It comes from way before the era of financialization. And I think it's an appropriate moment on which to end this particular talk this evening. It comes from the film Casablanca.
Everybody is to leave here immediately. This cafe is closed until further notice. Clear the room at once.
How can you close me up? On what ground?
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here.
You're winning, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.
Thank you very much.
First of all, let me thank you for Professor Kay for really gracing our halls and delivering a very thought-provoking lecture. I know many of you had bought books to be autographed, so we have to make some time late because we had another event following. Let me show your appreciation to Professor Kay for I have a little souvenir.
Oh, thank you very much.
Remember the cold day.
The cold day in Hong Kong. Thank you very much.